Welcome to our first podcast of 2025. I'm your host, Jim Jorgensen, and today we're going to be discussing audience questions about the 340B program with Visante subject matter experts Kristin Fox-Smith and Sean Hall. We did a pod last year on infusion services using this approach, and it actually ended up as our most listened to show. So we asked our audience to submit their 340B related questions and concerns, and we got some great questions to kick off this year's podcast series. So let's get going. Let's start with a refresher of what your current roles are at Visante. And let's go Kristin and then Sean.
Sounds great. Thank you, Jim. And thanks for the opportunity. And I look forward to being able to share some timely information with both our clients and the 340B community at large. So Kristin Fox-Smith, I'm a managing director here at Visante and have the opportunity to oversee the audit and compliance support areas of our 340B program division. Sean?
Thanks, Kristin. My name is Sean Hall. I'm a senior 340B program director on the audit and compliance team at Visante, and I oversee our individuals who are working in our program management side of our business, helping covered entities with the day-to-day management of their 340B programs.
So, Jim, I wanted to start with a question that we've received several times through various sources at this point. And I think given a lot of the changes that are coming in January as it relates to government and where things are headed in politics, I was hoping that you could answer this question just given all of the bigger picture items that you have some exposure to. So we've had a lot of questions relative to the Republican sweep of the Oval Office, House and Senate, and the current conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And we're being asked, is anything related to the 340B program in jeopardy as a result of this change?
Yeah, great question. That is the billion-dollar, or in this case, multi-billion-dollar question for sure. I think in terms of the overall viability of the 340B program, I don't think there's reason for concern there. Historically, I think the program's always enjoyed bipartisan support, and there are a lot of Republican districts with limited hospital access and where those hospitals depend on 340B for their continued financial health. And certainly legislators are well aware of this. And, with razor thin margins in the House and Senate, I don't think there would ever be enough votes to eliminate the program. That said, however, I do think there should be reason for concern regarding Republican-led initiatives to reform the program. Representative Buddy Carter from Georgia, who's a pharmacist, will be taking over the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Health Subcommittee. And in the House, Energy and Commerce has jurisdiction over 340B. And he's been a vocal program critic and reform advocate. And similarly, on the Senate side, Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, a physician, will be taking over as chair of the Health Committee, which has 340B jurisdiction there in the Senate. And he also has been a program critic. But on the positive side, though, I think Senator John Thune from South Dakota will be taking over as Senate Majority Leader, and he'll control what comes before the Senate. And he's a strong program supporter, so there will be a measure of protection there. I think the biggest concern that I have is the potential to enact changes through the budget reconciliation process, which wouldn't require 60 votes in the Senate. And I think the thing I'm most paying attention to is the potential to reduce reimbursement for Medicare Part B drugs purchased through the 340B program. Although at this point, there really isn't anything concrete in terms of direction for some of these changes, but well worth paying attention to. Something else we got a lot of questions around is manufacturers moving to a rebate model as opposed to an upfront discount. And this is currently being litigated, but if this were to move ahead, what do you think the impact would be for covered entities?
I think I know there's a lot of concern with this proposal. I know there's a lot of hopeful covered entities and individuals hoping that the legislation goes the direction that they're hoping for and that advocacy works to covered entities' advantage. The concern here is that moving to this model would increase the cost of goods for covered entities' medication purchases. And given that medications are the greatest expense within health, hospitals, health systems, grantee sites right now, I think the ability for a lot of covered entities to meet the needs with the price they're paying up front, and having some sort of reflection with their wholesaler contracts and their cost of goods, I think will pose a significant challenge for a lot of our smaller covered entities. So community hospitals, rural referral centers, critical access hospitals, just maintaining par levels and day-to-day drugs on shelf will get exponentially more expensive if we move to this model. And it's very concerning. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything you just said, Kristin. I'd also add to that, even for larger health systems, this move, if it goes through, would add a lot of additional complexities to the program. As we've seen with the contract pharmacy restrictions, each manufacturer has, different nuances with how they implement their policies and what's required of covered entities. So you're not just looking at that upfront cost increase, you're also looking at an increased need for resources. And ultimately, with some of these policies, it would move to the manufacturer being ultimately replacing or supplementing the TPA and making the final say on 340B qualifications. So I think there's a lot of different considerations where costs all around are going to go up, and it's definitely going to lead to that increased resource drain on covered entities.
Yeah, and I think for many covered entities, I mean, they're already on very small margins, 1%, 2%. And just the impact on cash flow is going to be significant. And we really have no idea what a timely reimbursement for those rebates looks like at this point either.
I will say, in regards to that cash flow statement, Jim, we've had covered entities make changes or transitions from one TPA provider to another. And with the holdup in time from the last payment received by the previous vendor to the first payment received by the new vendor, we've seen gaps of anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks with initial payments. And we've had covered entities have to identify opportunities to keep staffs paid, to keep, salaries moving at times where they don't have that revenue coming in the event that 340B is that, substantive to their overall revenue as a program. So, it's concerning to think about any downtime that may happen with a transition like this, in addition to any of the TPA vendors having technology that's ready to move to this model. I just think there's far more negatives than there are positives.
Yeah, I think another thing to keep in mind too is the bond rating for hospitals. We've already seen a downward movement trend in the hospital market in terms of bond rating, which can have a very significant financial impact on hospitals, particularly those that are in the middle of a building project. And one of the key determinants for your bond rating is days cash on hand. And certainly anything like this that could negatively impact cash reserves could have a detrimental effect on bond ratings, which could be very significant for hospitals.
Agreed.
Another question here. What are you expecting for 2025 in terms of HRSA audits?
We expect they're going to look much like 2024, which is a mix of remote audits and on-site audits. What we continue to see is that audits that are being done remote by the Visante group tend to be shorter in duration and have been much less thorough. Those remote audits are usually a day and a half max, and we've seen many on-site visits that are extending to 2 full days. And so I think just the level of detail involved in being able to really get into the TPA technology vendor systems of the covered entity and put their eyes on inventory and the procurement materials process, I think that's quite different when it's happening on-site versus remote. We still anticipate a large number of audits and the same mix we've seen in the past of number of grantees versus number of hospital or health system audits. I will say that one trend that we've seen the last several years that seems to be continuing is if one covered entity within a system gets an audit notification and has findings of any sort, we're finding that other covered entities within that same organization end up receiving audit notices not long after. So if you're a 5 or 6 hospital system with several grantees, an HTC and maybe a Ryan White program, we're seeing that over the course of a year to 2 years, each of those covered entities are receiving audit notices. So I do think there's some relation there.
Just a quick follow-up there. One of the changes proposed for the program was the implementation of a user fee with the assumption that that user fee then could go to support more audits. What do you see happening there?
I think increasing user fees to increase audits feels like we're taking a step in the wrong direction, when in reality, manufacturer audits have always been a possibility with HRSA, and so few manufacturer audits have been conducted. In addition, there's so much confusion and misinformation with all of the restrictions, the manufacturer restrictions in the 340B space right now, that I think it would be much wiser if we're going to increase user fees, use those dollars and really start auditing manufacturers and really start requiring that they go through the same motions and hurdles that covered entities have to go through when demonstrating auditable records. I think that would be money better spent.
Some states have enacted additional reporting requirements for 340B. How do you see these data being used? And do you think this will be something we can expect more states to adopt in the future?
Yeah, I think transparency has always been a criticism of the 340B program, that hospitals haven't been required to publish any of the numbers around what their savings are or spend around the 340B program. So to the second part of the question, I would expect that more states will likely join in on this and pass similar measures requiring covered entities, just because it is with it being such a prominent and common criticism of the program, that would move towards transparency. Now, as far as what that data is going to be used for, that's where I would potentially have concerns. Similar to what we've seen with other data collection requirements, we really don't know what that may be used for. Manufacturers and PBMs can use it on the back end to go after rebates and things like that. So, and I know a lot of hospitals worry about their financials around this being public, potentially giving potentially ammo to that extra criticism if they have a high degree of savings at that hospital. So I think it's something where there's a lot of unknowns behind it, and hospitals don't really like that unknown piece of the 340B program. On top of that, having these additional requirements is going to add additional resources that are needed by covered entities to be able to make sure they're properly publishing these, collecting the data, and making sure they're staying consistent with whatever their state's requirements are around what they're publishing.
Two-part question here. Contract pharmacy remains a flashpoint for critics of the program, and we're seeing continual battles at the state level to eliminate or reduce manufacturer-imposed restrictions. First part, what are you seeing in terms of covered entity operations relative to ESP and savings tracking? And second part, how do you see this issue playing out?
Yeah, so we support a wide variety of covered entities across the country that have all sorts of different approaches to the ESP program. We see some hospitals that have gone full in on it, provide all the data, do all their designations, because just that amount of revenue and savings that would be lost is just too great to overcome, and it's worth it to go forward with that data submission and do that data sharing. We've seen other covered entities and organizations that really want nothing to do with this. They don't feel comfortable sharing any amount of data and have opted to accept that loss on the contract pharmacy side. And then there's some that are in the middle. We've seen this program continue to evolve from the time that these restrictions first came into play, where initially it was just a fairly clean data submission and you get your pricing back. We've seen manufacturers move to different models where you're only allowed a single pharmacy designation, and then they put other requirements, including that you can't have a designation with an in-house pharmacy, which impacts a lot of hospitals across the country. So everyone's really got their own, they have to really address their own situation and see what fits best for them. And we've seen that that's taken many different shapes all over the country, depending on that particular covered entity setup.
Maybe a personal follow-up there. One of the things that we saw early on in the program was slippage in terms of, you get all your data organized and submitted, and then all of a sudden something drops out and you have to go back and resubmit and reorganize your data. Is that still a concern out there?
Yes, absolutely. It's actually become more of a concern as we've gotten farther into this. Some manufacturers have tightened the timeframes around their data submission requirements. So while we still have some as high as 45 days, we have some as low as a 14-day turnaround. Now, we know in the pharmacy world, you can have a lot of things happen in 14 days with any claims data that's come through and is going out to be billed, which has definitely led to additional slippage at some covered entities where they're just not able to get that data within the required time frame. On top of that, every TPA has a different approach to this program, and they've had varying degrees of success, or failures in some cases, where some TPAs just haven't been able to get their systems to work appropriately to really effectively manage the constant gaining and loss of pricing.
With more and more manufacturers imposing contract pharmacy restrictions, the amount of work required just to keep up with data submission requirements just keeps growing. Any tips to help cope with this seemingly never-ending expansion of data requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I think one general tip is just to take it one step at a time, and don't, sometimes you can get so involved with everything that's going on that you don't really see the forest through the trees, and you really need to take one step at a time and get one step of your program in line first before moving on to the next. What we've seen is, we have 8 states right now that have bills passed to block these restrictions, and those are in varying stages of implementation. Something where not only does each state have slightly different language to the bills they're passing, each manufacturer interprets that differently. So within one state, we could have 20 different interpretations from the manufacturer side, in varying areas of the program. So some of those could be, where your entity is located, where your pharmacy is located. Some require them both to be in the same state. Some allow them to be in different states. It really depends on the state and that particular manufacturer. So ultimately, it really leads to a drain on resources. Again, I know that is a common theme with my thoughts on this topic, but it really is one of the biggest things that's impacting covered entities here, aside from the loss of savings, is that increase in resources that are needed to maintain this. And that's where I really think taking it, back to basics and taking it one step at a time, assessing your particular situation, what state you're located in, if there's any laws that are relevant specific to your state and your setup, and go, kind of addressing each manufacturer one at a time from there to make sure you can get all of the appropriate data submissions or designations in place that are needed in order to gain some of that savings back.
Currently, the program doesn't mandate how savings are to be used. Do you think there'll be additional efforts in 2025 to better align the program with patient needs?
I believe covered entities I'm aware of many covered entities that are trying to put something in place like this right now, and are trying to draw straight lines to areas that have been funded or services that have been increased as a result of access to 340B savings. This has become harder to do with the contract pharmacy losses that we've seen over the last several years, because a lot of covered entities are hesitant to commit to funding certain programs. So we have some that are hosting smoking cessation programs or free vaccine clinics, but they're hesitant to direct dollars from savings directly there, given if those savings are gone tomorrow, they still want to offer those smoking cessation programs and free vaccine programs, and don't want to miss out on the opportunity to provide that type of patient access, even without the designated dollars. So what we're seeing is through a lot of community benefit awareness and a lot of the community benefit statements that most health systems are publishing and a lot of grantees are publishing every year, they're trying to identify ways in which they can use some of the 340B savings just to enhance overall patient care without specifically indicating which programs or which patient subsets the dollars will be going to. We're hoping that in the event that at some point it's a requirement that covered entities provide this level of detail, that we're at a place where the contract pharmacy dollars are back and they've stabilized, so that covered entities have a better idea of what do our savings look like once we hit maintenance mode. So if we're not adding any additional manufacturer restrictions, or if the landscape isn't going to change further, what would our contract pharmacy savings look like, so that we know what we can fund consistently versus what are dollars that are additional and beyond what that typical funding would look like. So I think we're going to see some changes in this regard, and continue to see covered entities that are hesitant to put specific dollar amounts to specific programs that are being funded, just given all of the variability right now with reimbursement in the contract pharmacy space.
Not only for 340B, but for other programs as well, application of modifiers has always been a challenge for pharmacy operations. What are you seeing in terms of modifier applications for 2025?
As it relates to modifier application, most of our covered entities are at a point where from a global billing and revenue cycle perspective, it's easier to apply the modifier across the board than it is to identify specific items that require a modifier. I'd say this is true with smaller systems like Meditech and Mosaic, as well as big systems like Cerner and Epic. It's often easier to do a blanket application of modifiers than it is to add the modifiers at the J code or even NDC specific level. So I think we're going to continue to see some ambiguity in terms of how revenue cycle departments are treating this, given that currently what would be viewed in an audit is the NDC, the application of the modifier, and then generally just that a price is present, whether or not it was an acquisition price or whether or not it was a WAC price or a WAC with a multiplier. There really isn't any way for auditors to determine where that price or how that price was calculated. But the modifier application is a critical. So I think we're going to continue to see blanket applications of modifiers across most health systems just for consistency's sake.
Excellent. Great questions and great information. Any final thoughts on the 340B program that you both want to share before we sign off?
I would just like to share that we have so many great advocacy groups in the space that are continuing to try to further the program and provide clarification in areas that do seem gray. I think we'll continue to see some questioning regarding patient definition and patient eligibility, and we'll continue to have covered entities that don't want to be straddling a gray line and want to just be given facts, help us understand the black and white facts, and we'll make compliant decisions from that point. So I think the more we can do to standardize and formalize the process in regards to patient eligibility and criteria related to 340B eligibility, I think the easier it will be for our covered entities to comply. And at the end of the day, that they want to comply. They want to be providing the information they should be providing. They want to have clean audits, and they want to make sure that they're practicing in the program in the most compliant manner possible. Sean, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add, with all of the constant changes to these manufacturer restrictions and potential moves to rebate programs, I would just, advise any covered entities that they keep a close eye on any regulations that are coming out regarding those areas. And if you have a close relationship with your state representatives, or if you have a government advocacy group, to do your best to advocate at the state level. To try to get something moved through, because if you're in one of those states that hasn't pushed through any sort of bill to impact these, it's something that they really need to hear the covered entity stories and how it's impacting hospitals and the loss of savings and what impacts that can have on the community, to really try to push the state to help with this issue. So far, we haven't seen any movement on a federal level really around anything to block pricing restrictions aside from the various lawsuits that have been in place. And thus far, the state level bills that have been passed have been the most successful thing so far that has helped with this issue. So I would definitely recommend continuing to advocate at the state level to try to get some kind of changes made.
Yeah, and we've mentioned this before, but I'd also suggest if you haven't already established a relationship with your hospital lobbying efforts, make sure you do that so that you can keep them well informed of what's happening from your perspective in the 340B program. And that can potentially be incorporated into their overall lobbying efforts. Well, thanks again, Kristin and Sean, for joining the podcast. And thanks, everyone, for the questions. And thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.